Susan Johnson-Cook is next. She served as the International Religious Freedom Ambassador from 2011 to 2013 in President Barack Obama's administration. You went in and you served well in that role, and I deeply appreciate that. And then finally, we Rabbi David Saperstein, who was in that role, was nominated in 2014, was my immediate predecessor, and I've worked a lot with David on, any number of things around the world. Of the three, he's the one I see the most. We seem to travel together at a lot of these different activities. Most recently, we were both in Saudi Arabia, of all places, opening up and seeing that country open up a little bit to religious freedom, which that was a historic event that we were at. And so in a sense, I really feel like there's some credit there. Okay, Ambassador Hanford, 3 minutes, and tell us what you'd like us to hear.
Great, thank you, Sam. When I began working on international religious freedom back in the 1980s, as Sam referred to, there were just 2 organizations in DC and a handful of people focused on this issue, and I was the first and only person doing so in the U.S. government. Now, it's such a joy to see so many dedicated to this cause out here. And I want to thank all of you for your devotion and for all that you have built together. I don't need to tell you this, but it's one of the greatest privileges imaginable to serve some of the most noble people in the world, and then to be constantly humbled and inspired by their example and their sacrifice. But by any measure, it is an overwhelming task we take on together. Well over half of the world is living under serious persecution or restriction of their freedom. But it's not just overwhelming in scope. Our cause is also one of the most difficult on earth to address, even, I would argue, one of the most daunting in history. We're attempting to persuade authoritarian governments or intractable religious majorities, sometimes thousands of miles away, to drastically change cultural norms that have often existed for centuries. That's a tough lift. So, if I am to condense down here in 2 minutes, decades of work, here's what I would commend. First, figure out where you are best gifted and positioned to serve the persecuted. Pick a lane and do it well. Maybe it's fact-finding or legal advocacy or humanitarian support for those who are suffering. I received some wise counsel when I had my first meeting with the Deputy Secretary of State. He said, "John, don't try to take on the whole world. You'll wind up with little, if anything, accomplished. Figure out where you can bring lasting change and focus there." I took his advice. And if instead I had spread myself thin and not been dogged in our work on countries like Vietnam, Saudi Arabia, Turkmenistan, China, Eritrea, Uzbekistan, and a few others, I think we would have fallen far short of what we achieved. Secondly, be relentless. Be relentless. Whatever your role in advancing religious freedom, be relentless. There are no shortcuts in religious freedom work. People do not change easily, and nations do not change easily. This has been the lesson of my experience over and over again. Whether pushing for laws or constitutions to be revised, prisoners to be released, torture or executions to be stopped, I have found that it's almost always very, very difficult and sometimes takes years to bring change. Third, be a good ally with integrity to your fellow servants of the persecuted. Over the years, I've seen that advocacy of all sorts often attracts strong personalities that can wind up fracturing what ought to be cooperative efforts. We don't need armchair critics. We need allies. Don't try to build up your work by tearing down the work of others. No, let's cheer each other on. Let's honor each other's service and unique contributions. So in sum, let's press hard with integrity. Then, when we come together at important conferences like this summit, we'll be in the best position to learn from each other and advance our cause together. It's been a great privilege for me to work with many of you in this great endeavor, and thank you all for your service to the persecuted.
Thank you, John.
you, I would start with saying thank you for your work for the persecuted all over the world. Not only did I have to pick a lane, I had to create some lanes. As the first African American, the first female, and first faith leader to come into the role, we created what was called the Faith Leaders Roundtable. We also created Female Faces of Faith, and the Female Faces of Faith turned into a roundtable so that many voices that were not at the table to discuss international religious freedom, but who had been doing the work, were able to be part of the conversation. So this is my formula: diversification, collaboration, cooperation, and it will equal transformation. And that we must make sure that there is also conversation among the voices who are doing the work, who continue to do the work. One of the things we were able to do, not just abroad, but over here as well, we were able to meet with county and refugees who have been able to escape the persecution or brought their families over and helped them escape persecution. We were able to meet with Uyghur families, Yazidis. And what we found most of all was that they wanted to help with not only the government's help, but they also wanted to be part of the help in helping their families settle here and also begin a new life here once they got here. So one of the things I recommend in terms of conversation is to have discussion with the religious leaders of all major groups and continue what we did in government to happen outside of government, and to make sure that women are part of that conversation. I've been fortunate and blessed enough to work with Brian Graham, Religious Freedom in Business, Shireen Tabor, Women in Religious Freedom in Films, Reverend Rob Shank, where I was able to meet with the Yazidis 1 week before it actually hit the news in terms of how they were being persecuted. All of that happened on these shores. Lastly, we were able to meet with the Religious Freedom Institute, which was at the time in the museum, and it was with Dr. Sabrina Dent. And for the first time, we were able to introduce international religious freedom as part of the curriculum for historically African American theological seminaries. And so I think, as I also work with Black women in ministry universally around the world. And so what we have found is that many of the women who are faith leaders are the ones who nurture the families who come here, whose husbands, many cases, have been left on the continents, and who are being persecuted. And so that part of the conversation needs to be, how do we nurture? How do we help those who have suffered trauma if they've been able to escape? How do we help make sure that their families and their descendants won't have the same persecution? So I think, as my formula started out, diversification, collaboration, consolidation, cooperation equals transformation. I'm very excited to see what's happening in terms of USERF, making sure that there are diverse voices in USERF, making sure that there are diverse voices on the staff of the International Religious Freedom Office, and making sure there's diversity in ambassadors. So we support certainly Ambassador Rashad now, who's there, and I think he's the first Muslim to hold this role. I think we just need to make sure that there are all voices at the table, and that will make a serious difference. So not only do you have to choose a lane, sometimes you have to create the lane and then walk in that lane. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Ambassador Saperstein.
So very quickly, we were acknowledging people. I simply want to name 4 other people who deserve just to be named here. I was glad that you talked about the history that John played in terms of the history of all of this, but you should know that his wife Laura on the House side was playing a robust well as well. So they're kind of a power couple of the history of Earth here. Secondly, in this panoply of people, the person on my left here, Bob Seipel, father of Chris Seipel, was the first ambassador and set the standard in the foundation that all the rest of us have benefited from. Rashan was saying we couldn't have a better person in this position now, but I think all of us know that Sam Brownback lifted the standard of this work in so many different ways, and it's truly a lasting legacy. So a few thoughts about where we might go. That, as I understand the challenge, we're all doing everything we're doing, and yet persecution and discrimination and the challenges and restrictions on religious freedom are so pervasive and so heartrending all across the globe. What can be done differently? So let me just suggest a couple of things to think about. One is, we created this entire structure in part as an affirmative action program to the human rights world, the Human Rights Office, the human rights organizations, the regional human rights courts, that weren't paying enough attention to religious freedom. We wanted to lift religious freedom up to the kind of attention free speech, the freedom of the press, freedom of association, freedom of protest, and other fundamental human rights act. And I think we have succeeded in many regards about that. But I want to be clear, I'm going to focus on this in my remarks tomorrow. No human right makes it unless they all make it. If democracy falters and dies across the globe, we're not going to save religious freedom. There's no Noah's Ark for religious freedom here. We have to continue to push the human rights field to back religious freedom, but we also need, more than we've done before, to push all of the religious leaders in the world and all of the proponents of religious freedom to push for protecting democracy and nurturing democracy and nurturing human rights as well. So that's number one. Number two, why is it that certain campaigns get attention and others don't? Why is it that Darfur captured fire where the 17-year civil war that killed and displaced more people than Kosovo, Bosnia, and Rwanda combined had done really was just a small group of entities, and Sam Brownback played a very important role on the Hill as senator on that. Why is it happening that today, if you look at the Rohingya and Uyghur Muslims, they are catching attention, Tibetan Buddhists in the past, and so many others don't, and we're often competing with each other for our particular group, our particular cause. In thinking about it, trying to work out what makes things work, and I think we know a lot of indecent about it, to try and have a meta-campaign on behalf of religious freedom with engaging media at the level we have to do, and celebrities at the level that we have to do to get the sort of tip on this issue can be vitally important in going forward. So I'll stop with that for right now. I have a couple of other thoughts, but I just wanted to think big about changes that might happen that could really make a difference.
It's good thoughts. We sink or swim together. Okay, I'm going to try a little bit of a lightning round, and I'd like 1-minute answers. Guys, if I could do that. We got about 9.5 minutes left. John, why have we not succeeded thus far? And then I'm going to follow this up with what will it take to succeed. So give me 1 minute. Why have we not succeeded?
Well, part of the reason is that we're up against, as I said earlier, cultural traditions and norms that we can't expect to be overturned quickly. A second problem is, Sam, when I started in this work on the Hill, I was getting my information through the mail and through the phone. We didn't have the internet then. But now not only are we helped by hearing about problems and able to jump on them quickly, but the other side is able to see what efforts of persecution work. We see anti-conversion laws, for example, spreading, and so tactics of persecution can spread, and authoritarian governments that crack down give, unfortunately, ideas to other authoritarian governments. So we're up against that sort of a globalization of persecution. I don't think we should be too hard on ourselves. We've had a lot of successes. We heard about some earlier and some represented in this room, and I'll touch on that later.
Suzan, why have we not succeeded thus far?
First, I gotta say, you have me between the ambassador who uses his left hand and the rabbi who uses his right hand. So I'm like, they're very expressive. So thank you very much.
So I think, Ambassador Hanford talked about, cultural norms. And I think when you talk about cultural norms, you have to have people not just going in, but you have to have someone who's from that culture who helps you tackle the problems that historically have been there. The second is, I would suggest that we get together more often, having been in the role. I mean, this is our second time, I think, all of us together in the last 25 years. And I would suggest that we get together because each of us has seen some advancements under our tenure, and when we put those all together, we can say, where do we need to go from here? So I would suggest frequently for us to be able to be in dialogue, and I think that will begin some conversations. We all have our networks, but we also can make sure that those networks take us to places where perhaps the other one couldn't go.
David White.
Well, I suggested this meta campaign precisely because the vast majority of the world, despite all of our efforts, don't know. They simply don't know what's going on, and if they did, and we were doing it effectively, it can make a profound difference. I suggested the other point of this in terms of human rights, because in part we're competing with so many crises across the globe, so many crises of race in the world, the crisis of gender in the world, the crisis of climate change in the world, the crisis of pandemics in the world, the crisis of structural economic inequities here, and we have a sense that we're at crossroads and we're running out of time and we're overwhelmed by all the problems. How do we take this problem and either lift it up or show it's indispensable to achieving these other ones as well here? And we have to think more holistically in order to do that.
John, what's the biggest thing you got, or we've gotten, maybe as a movement, right over the last 25 years? What's the biggest thing we've gotten right?
Well, I'll focus on our niche. Our niche has been to work government to government, because open diplomatic channels allows us to get in the door, sit face to face, and negotiate for hours and hours and hours. And I was famous for having the longest meetings of U.S. officials because there was so much to cover. And it's worked. When I was there, we saw Vietnam do a U-turn. They were in intense persecution. And by working with them, then adding them to the CPC list of the worst violators, and then getting them to sign a binding agreement, it's like a treaty, and working them off, it was remarkable, the U-turn that they did. It's the only time I've seen a sitting government make a change like that. But it can happen. It can happen again and again with Saudi Arabia. A lot of time spent traveling there, meeting, and they, in the end, were willing to say that they would remove all intolerant references in all of their school books that they propagate to hundreds of thousands of madrasas around the world using their oil money. And they were pledging that they would remove all intolerance towards other religions, which includes Muslims too, Jews, Christians, and then we followed up a lot with that. So in our niche, it can work. We simply need more firepower. We need other governments coming on board, and they are. There's a lot to be encouraged about on that front, I believe.
Susan, what do we
I
got right?
totally agree on the government to government, getting our foot in the door. I also think where we weren't able to do that, having the multilateral conversations for the UN General Assembly, I think that those were places where we also saw some inching where they may not have given before, but they said, now we're in the room with others, and so we have to make some differences. The escape, helping the pastors in Iran to be able to escape, I think that was major, and we focused all of our attention at that one time. We made that a priority, and I think that was a major advancement as well. So as we saw so many changes, but I think it's inch by inch, and I think we should give ourselves credit for the places that we did make a difference.
Rabbi.
Well, just to what Ambassador Kutcher said, that she really helped put on the table the need to have women at the table everywhere, at every level, if we're going to make a difference. It really is part of your lasting legacy here. What was this entire enterprise about? It was that religious groups and NGOs can't do this alone. It requires government. Here, John, you've made that point over and over again. We had to move government and governments to make a difference. I think we've made a profound difference in that. We've structured things. During the Kerry administration, when I served in the Religion and Global Affairs Office, was as large and robust as our office, we had more full-time professionals working on religion and foreign policy than all the governments in the world combined. The annual report we did required now after all these years, thousands of Foreign Service officers to go and meet with press groups and persecuted groups and get their story and put it into the report. It's transformed the culture of the Foreign Service in terms of understanding this issue. And then Sam Brownback came along, actually building on what Yusuf and Nance Haynes and then my office did to build the contact group, came up with this vision of, pulled off the ministerial that has so engaged. You look around the world and see the impact we've had, where there are now ambassadors in other countries, there are now dedicated Foreign Service offices in other countries. There's now more cooperation and engagement in terms of working it. Altogether, that is an enormous impact, and that puts us in a very strong position to meet the daunting challenges.
And I'm going to call my own number here. I think we need to start putting economic sanctions associated with religious persecution and persecution. I think we need to start making it light. I think the Uyghur Forced Labor Act, although that's not technically a Religious Freedom Act, I consider it a product of religious freedom activists, and it's got economic sanctions with it. When you get a bite, you get an answer. All right, we've got 1 minute here, David. I'm going to start with you. What is your prayer for this group? 15 seconds. What's your prayer for this group, Rabbi?
That you can never lose hope. Here, we are the eternal optimists on these things. My mentor, Al Rorsby, used to say, the difference between an optimist and a pessimist is that an optimist argues this is the best of all possible worlds. A pessimist agrees. We are the eternal optimists here, and together, you and I together, we really can change the world. Susan?
My prayer is that we never stop praying, we never stop working together. When we work together, we walk together, we win together, and there is hope. So keep up alive, to use Reverend Jesse Jackson's term, but let's not stop doing what we're doing. Let's just do it together. When we work together, we can win together.
Mr. Hanford.
Your question about prayer and your emphasis on it prompts me to also say prayer is the most effective thing by far and puts our work to shame. And so that would be my encouragement. But also, many of you are in a position to do work that we cannot do, that all the governments together cannot do, that NGOs working through a personal relationship with a local official or a religious leader can perhaps lead them to see things in a different way. And then we can work together, but sometimes we need to keep that work quiet. If we're trying to stop an execution of someone in a very conservative Islamic country, which some of us have been involved in, that needs to be done quietly, because usually the population, not just the leaders, would want to see the person executed. So more power to those of you in the NGO community.
And we should add that the effort that Greg Mitchell's leading on to take the roundtable that you so strengthened here and make that a phenomenon across the globe is one important piece moving forward. But what would your prayer for these people, the folks gathered here, Ambassador Reed?
My prayer is that this grassroots movement goes global, and that this is a grassroots movement. Grassroots movements change governments. Governments address each other, but if you want to change the government, you got to do it from the bottom up. And I think if really every faith community in the world would embrace religious freedom for everybody, not just for your own faith community, but for everybody, I think we transform these governments that are persecuting people. We've got to stand together, but it's got to be grassroots. It's got to be churches, synagogues, mosques, temples, all banding together in these religious freedom roundtables at the grassroots and changing the tops. Everybody, we love you. I know most of you in the room, I think, and I'm just really proud of all of you, for what you guys have done and how you inspire us. And I'm like John, I remember when you could call a religious freedom meeting and you'd have 5 people in the room, and that was counting my dog. It was a small group, and now you're an army, and this army needs to take over and change the world for everybody that is voiceless and being persecuted. God bless you all.